Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of A Conversation with Cometan. We're now on season 4, episode 10, and I'm really excited today to be able to show you this interview that I did with Reverend Dr Malcolm Brown, who is part of the Church of England. And he and I have met before through my PhD work, and I wanted to kind of have a more informal conversation with him about all types of things, mainly salvation and nihilism, and also a little bit about atheism as well. So it was a fantastic conversation. I hope all you guys will enjoy listening to it. And without further ado, let's get on with the conversation. Well, thank you for joining me again, Malcolm. It's great to kind of have a more informal conversation today, maybe, because I first met you when I was doing my PhD work, and I'm still doing that, of course, but I'm at a sort of a later stage now with that. And I thought it'd be interesting for us to have just more of a general theology, philosophy kind of conversation. And really the sort of the main topic I wanted to sort of dig into today is sort of around salvation, actually. Which is something that sort of I think about often. It's something that's quite intriguing to me, and I wanted to kind of get your sort of latest ideas and views on this topic. So sort of my first question really was to ask, what does salvation mean to you? Because I feel like it's used so widely, and there's so many different forms of salvation and ways to achieve it. What does it mean to you, and maybe from the Anglican perspective, possibly, the Church of England?
Okay, well, first of all, the Anglican perspective is usually a bit of a chimera, because the Anglican Church has always been a bit of a coalition of different theological views. Yeah. But I think that's, in the case of salvation as a concept, that's a really interesting one, because I think the question, if you start from the Christian Gospels, is much more, what do you feel you need to be saved from?
Yes.
And so it will come as a different set of answers to different people. I did read something years and years ago, and I can't remember where or who by, that suggested that in a marketplace of faiths, religious faith used to be a matter of culture. Now it's much more of a global marketplace in some ways. He said, you might think of choosing your religion according to what it is you think you need saving from. Yeah. And so if, I can't remember it in detail, something like, if what you want to be saved from is annihilation, you might want to be a Buddhist with a theology of reincarnation.
Yes.
If you want to be saved from guilt and shame, you might turn to the Christian faith with its fascinating New Testament exploration of the relationship between law and guilt, and how you can actually get out of that loop. I mean, this is very much a Christian, it's not an Anglican view, it's a Christian view, drawing particularly on St. Paul's writings, where he contrasts the kind of dead-end loop. If you rely on being on the right side of the law, it's not the same as being a good person. Yes. And essentially, I think the Christian faith has been hugely influenced by Paul, who was a Jewish convert, worked with the Roman authority. He's a complex character. And I think that, we start, of course, as a theistic religion with the idea that there is a God. So that's a kind of given. And sometimes salvation doesn't make a lot of sense unless you put that in as an assumption that there is a God, and that it's a personal God, a God you can relate to, not just a life force or something like that. Mm-hmm. And most of all, in the Christian and to some extent the Jewish, in a different way, and not to some extent, but in a different way, the Jewish faith, a God of justice.
Yes.
Now, you've got to understand the history here. So this is going to be quite a long answer, I'm afraid. The history of a Jewish people who came out of exile, who had to find their identity, learn how to, instead of being victims, become powerful, learn how to regulate their own affairs. You have a Christian faith that came out of victimhood, of persecution, and had to learn that, what was it about that sociology, that, you know, being in a very dangerous place in an empire and in an occupied country where neither the indigenous population nor the occupiers had any time for you, and it was a matter of life and death. And so if you're contemplating death, and that's something that our culture in the 21st century is not good at, we prefer the concept of immortality and death as failure. But if you're living with death as an imminent reality, like you might say some people in the Ukraine and in other places these days, it concentrates the mind. And if you believe in a God of justice, first of all, you believe in a God of justice because you know that justice is never complete in this life.
Yes.
Okay. You know that you will go to your grave unvanquished. You know, your enemies will not be put down. You will not win, even if justice is on your side. Very often. So you believe in a God of justice who is putting, you know, is going to put things right, even though you may have died.
Yes.
Now that God of justice isn't always going to be on your side because you've got a few offences against your name as well. And that's to do with being human, to be fallible, finite. There are things we should have done, which we haven't done. We've made wrong choices. We've sometimes been actively wicked. So if you believe in a God of justice, what are you going to be saved from? You're going to be saved from a just judgment against your failings and your crimes. Yes. Now, the basic principle in Paul is if everything was ruled by justice, which one of us could stand?
Yes.
Now, that's a really helpful thing in the context of, in my view, in the context of worldly conflict, because it's not just about self-justification. It's not just saying, okay, God will sort it out after I'm dead and my enemies are going to have their faces ground in the dust. There is an element to that, of course, in the Christian and Jewish traditions, because it's about justice for whole peoples, not just for individuals. Yeah. But if you're calling for that kind of justice against your enemies, then remember your enemies are going to be calling for that kind of justice against you. And it might be that the judgment is against you on all sorts of things. So the salvation is actually about mercy. It's about being saved from the consequences of our own stupidity as much as anything, and our wickedness, because we've all got a streak of it. And, you know, if we're held to a rigorous account of justice, we're going to go down for a few years as well as the people we hate.
Yes.
So what we're being asked to be saved from is the consequences of justice, given that what we've done in our lives, because the concept of mercy and grace is stronger.
Yes.
And, you know, if someone you love intensely is being held to account for their crimes, you actually want mercy for them. You don't say they didn't do it, or you don't say they mustn't be punished. You say mercy.
Yes. Yes.
And you say it for yourself.
Yeah.
So for me, as a Christian, but not as by any means the only Christian perspective, let alone the only Anglican perspective, I would say salvation is salvation from the consequences of justice, because we cry for mercy.
Yeah.
Sorry, does that make sense?
Yes, it did. Yeah, it's fantastic. And also, would you agree also that part of the Christian understanding of salvation is also the Saviour?
Well, that's right. That's how it's achieved.
But obviously, in the Buddhist perspective, and maybe other, even like the sort of this New Age kind of thinking is that you have to save yourself, which is of course the very opposite thing, because in Buddhism there isn't that sort of almighty God. It's a non-theistic kind of religion, so it's all on you. You know, you got to save yourself. It
is, but it's also, I mean, I'm not going to say a word against Buddhism, although it's not my faith. And so what I do say about it may be wrong, but what I understand is that it's about the personal character. It's not about saving yourself at all costs, even at the price of trampling down other people.
Yeah.
You only save yourself through seeking the pacific teachings of, not specific, pacific,
yes,
peaceful teaching of the Buddha. And so, like most world faiths, there's an element there that's about salvation from interminable conflict.
Yes.
Not getting caught up in wars that end up with genocide and things like that, because they can't be resolved any other way. So I can't speak of all other faiths, of course, but in the Christian faith, it's the Savior who shows the way. Now, there are a number of competing theories about how this happened, because the Christian story is this person, Jesus, lived, he taught, he was betrayed and crucified. Yes. And his followers believed that he not exactly survived. It wasn't as if the death didn't happen, but the death was not the last word.
Yes.
Okay. And so they believed, although they couldn't put it into propositional arguments, that because of that, there was a route for their own salvation from guilt and the consequences. So there have grown up over the centuries a number of theories about this. One is that a vengeful God required someone to be punished and punished Jesus on behalf so that we didn't have to be punished.
Yes.
That's one view. Some people find that amoral or even immoral. But, on the other hand, you say, well, morality doesn't quite apply to God because he makes the rules. But there are others. One is the example that the person who lives as Jesus lived, putting others first, turning the other cheek, all that sort of thing. You may well suffer as a result, but as a result, that will not be the final sentence passed against you. The final sentence is not death if you live like that. So it's the kind of perfect exemplar theory.
Yes.
As Groucho Marx said, these are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others. That's my theology. But within the broad Christian tradition, there are others. But what they are called theologies of the atonement, the word atonement meaning at one-ment. It's one of those wonderful words that literally breaks down into its component parts. It's about how do we become one with God and with creation. So theologies of the atonement, there are many, because they're trying to make sense of a mystery. They're trying to make sense of the first Christians believing passionately that something fundamental had changed for them and for others, which wasn't about propositional logic. It was about something to do with the death of this man and what happened afterwards. And so since then, of course, people have been trying to make it make sense.
Yes, of course.
And so as I say, that's my theology. If you don't like it, there are others.
Yes, it's very interesting, and also I suppose as well, the reason why I'm interested in sort of this concept of salvation is maybe because every other aspect of Christianity and other religions seems to have been challenged in the modern scientific world, you could say. The existence of God being one example, of course. Do you think that this idea of salvation, I don't know, is maybe perhaps needed more than ever before in today's world? Does it still apply? This idea of sacrifice and these are very ancient ideas. Today we don't kind of think about, well, I don't know, does the modern person...
Well, I don't know. I think you get quite a lot. Look at people who are prepared to donate a kidney to a stranger. It's what's called supererogation in the classical philosophy. It's the thing that it would be great if someone did it, but nobody can be asked to do it because it's the bigger thing than anyone can be asked. You can't be required. It's like that old. You're far too young to remember this. The sketch show from the 50s, Beyond the Fringe, which was to some extent the first time the Second World War had ever been satirised. And there you are, Jones. Stand to attention now. It's we've decided at high command it's time for a pointless sacrifice.
Right.
But people do sacrifice themselves for strangers.
Yes.
There's a whole area in philosophy that I'm sure in ethics that I'm sure you're familiar with, of the kind of scenario. I'm walking past a fairly shallow pond and I see a toddler fall face down in the water and can't get out. I didn't push them. It's not my responsibility. It's not my toddler. But if I don't go in, because it's not going to drown me, and pull them out, I am remiss as a human being.
Yes.
There's no code of law that says it must be me who does it and not you.
Yeah.
But if I don't do it, I am actually, at no significant cost to myself, I am a deficient human being. And I think that's very widely accepted. It's there are areas where, people say, why should I do it? But, people do that sort of thing.
Yes.
And sometimes when there is a considerable risk to themselves. So I don't think the concept of sacrifice is dead. I think the transcendent supernaturalism of the Christian story, or, it's not supernatural in the kind of, movie sense, but the inexplicable mystery element is problematic for many people. And I'm very interested, incidentally, that back in the Second World War, as I was talking about that, George Orwell, who you'll be familiar with, great British writer, was spending a lot of his time thinking, what has happened to us that these totalitarianisms in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, and in Russia, because he was, violently anti-Soviet. How have these totalitarians arisen? What has been the condition of humanity that people have put their faith in dictators and systems of thought which will accept no variation at all on pain of death? What's happened here? This is in the period before we seem to be winning, when we had to ask, is Britain going to become a totalitarian state under Germany? And he concluded it comes back to the fact that the Christian idea of life after death has disappeared from the population as a whole. He said, if you believe in that, then you have to believe that justice will be worked out despite you dying, that there is a justice that will come.
Yes.
And if you don't believe that, if you set aside the idea of any kind of existence beyond your death, then you have to right every wrong against yourself in your life. Yes. There can be no room for compromise. You have to win 20-0 all the time. And he said that creates the mindset in which totalitarianism can flourish. Yes. He said the tragedy is, as he saw it as a non-believer, recovering the sense of life after death is an impossibility. Yes. So he had no solution to the rise of fascism and totalitarian communism, because he saw that it was the result of that loss of a popular belief, which he assumed had been there, a sense of justice that transcends my lifetime. Yes. So now I'm inclined to think, when we're looking at what's happening, I haven't seen the latest results in the midterms over the Atlantic, but looks a little closer than I feared. But the amazing numbers of people who are prepared to believe anything that Trump tells them, the closeness with which our British culture came to a kind of watered down gentlemanly version of Trumpism under Johnson, where truth mattered not one whit if it served the ends of the moment. Yes. Now, what is the sanction against that? If it gets you votes, if it wins, look how the Tories flirted with a Johnson comeback because he would win an election, possibly, not because he was a truthful or decent human being. No matter what the cost to anyone else, if it achieved the material goal of the moment. No concept there, surely, of eventual judgment. Yes, yes. And also... So that's why, you see, I think the Christian faith actually matters, not just as a hobby for the few who like that sort of thing, but because if we could restore that kind of faith in a God of justice, you have a massive bulwark against human wickedness. Yes. And also, as well, just going back slightly to the point about life after death and sort of a declining belief in that, do you think that's also the reason why maybe a focus has been placed on things like consumerism and these kind of, or hedonism even, sort of of happiness in this life clearly seems to be a sort of response to the non-existence, shall we say, of an afterlife, and that seems to be the sort of the contingency. Well, I think it's actually more complicated than that, and funnily enough, the Christian faith has a little bit of complicity in all that, because we're not just a spiritual movement. The Christian faith takes the physical body seriously. Yes. Not always. I mean, some Christians are very dualistic about the body and mind, body's spirit. But I think generally we are a material faith.
Mm.
We believe that what you do with stuff, including your own body, matters.
Yeah.
And therefore, it makes us the kind of faith that gets anxious about climate change.
Yes.
You might, for instance, argue that if we're all assured of our own salvation, what the hell does it matter if the world burns up? But it's not an individual faith in that sense. It has a concern for generations to come. It has a concern for the material world because it believes that that is created by God and hallowed by God. Yeah. So it's a material world, takes the material world seriously. But lurking within the faith is also this idea of human domination, of dominion over the created order, that because we are, little less than God, we've had a sort of delegated authority over the material world. And that's been hugely misused over the centuries to justify all kinds of things. And so we have our own ambiguities to work through in the history of the Christian faith, which of course started at a time when resources were pretty plentiful and the human population was small, and we hadn't begun to realize the impact of our own existence on the existence of everything. So we hadn't come into the what's the term for this kind of geological era which is dominated by the human? There's a word for it. Anthropocene. That's it. Yeah, that's the word. We hadn't contemplated that then. So I think the Christian faith has some thinking to do on that to make itself coherent again, because we followed one strand in our faith, in our doctrines, to the neglect of others that should be there as correctives to that idea. But you asked about consumerism, and some of it, I guess, is sort of buying your way to immortality. Mm-hmm. But I think actually it's more casual than that. It comes out of a sense of living in an age of plenty, which we've not yet adapted to. If ask any serious economist, and the fundamental given is scarcity, not plenty.
Yes.
And I think there have even been movements in philosophy that have said that that is a huge mistake, and we should be working on a fundamental assumption of abundance. Yeah, right. You might get that in a consumer culture. I don't think you'd say that in sub-Saharan Africa, So I think the scarcity principle is important because it teaches us good stewardship of the natural world. But as I say, it comes back to the fact we're not just a spiritual movement. We are serious about the body, about the created order, about material stuff. So that suggests probably, consumerism is not a good thing, but we've to some extent brought it on ourselves, and we've got to do some work on that as a Christian faith. I think we're getting into the realm of pop psychology a bit. What is it that other people want to be saved from? And I think you can draw false conclusions by generalizing about people who are not like yourself. You need actually to work with the lived experience. Yes. What is it that actually existentially I find I need to be liberated from?
Yes. Yeah. And also one thing that I wanted to talk about today was also about nihilism, which I think is a really interesting sort of collection of ideas, really. Sometimes a little bit scary as well, for someone who is pretty on the other end of the spectrum from nihilism, for myself. And I've just found that in my own experience of talking to sort of the younger generation, maybe, is that, I don't know, life for them, people who've not sort of been brought up in maybe a religious family or people who explore or people who are philosophical, that life is sort of a bit meaningless, and I've just come across this. I'm not saying that the whole younger generation believes this, but I have come across this, and it's quite strange. It's a strange belief, I think. And I don't know, have you come across this kind of thing?
You've got to remember, Brandon, at my age, at my age, the younger generation encompasses about 5 generations.
Yes.
So I wouldn't want to generalize. Probably not 5, but you know what I mean.
Maybe.
I mean, my kids are now middle-aged.
Right.
My grandchildren are in school.
Yes.
Which are we talking about here? And of course, you can't generalize wildly.
Yes.
And we're talking, I guess, here about people in a Western contemporary context. And I guess, especially in an era where we have had several generations, including mine, who have made the primary principle the idea that people must make their own minds up.
Yes.
We've been very nervous, my generation, of bringing up our kids to believe what we believe, to do, to treat us as an example. We've thrown the responsibility back. Again, a massive generalization, but it is a reasonable generalization to say, essentially, sorry, kids, you've got to find your own way in life. I happen to be a Christian, but hey, that's nothing to do with, and so we haven't brought our children up to actually see the virtues of our own practices.
Yes.
And so if we've said you've got to make it up for yourself, is it any wonder that some of them come to a conclusion that this is beyond me?
Yes.
Make it up for myself.
Yes.
So I think that unlike most other cultures which have tried to pass on their fundamental beliefs, we've been much more leery of doing that. So it's not surprising that there are generations who are struggling, because it's almost a principle that you mustn't tell anyone else what to think.
Yes.
Which doesn't mean authoritarian. It means being a good example and suggesting that this is not just my choice. It's chosen because it's a good example. And it's good because, we actually need a few more ethicists in the population to say these things. Nihilism, well, we're not talking about a conscious creed here, are we? I don't think you're talking about the sense of hopelessness and pointlessness. But I don't know. There are two things I'd want to suggest on that. One is, this is a hunch. I don't have any data. My hunch is that many people do come to ask questions that lead them in the direction of some kind of life philosophy, but they ask those questions later and later in life. And we do a lot of things later and later in life. If you compare the generations, we marry later, we have children later, we get mortgages later, we take responsibility later. And I think some of these questions arise when you have, first of all, responsibilities, but then, especially with kids, a responsibility for a legacy.
Yes.
And you're thinking, once you've got kids, you hope they outlive you. One of the most tragic things, is to go to the funeral of your own child. Because that's that fundamental unspoken hope has been dashed.
Yeah.
So when you start thinking about these things, do you then where do you turn? And I think over several generations, people have turned back to the Christian faith in this country, or to the faith of their fathers, because they've had it somewhere as a seed within them.
Yes.
We're now at a stage where people have nothing to turn back to, because they haven't had that early practice, of being sent to Sunday school, as my generation was, so that my parents had a couple of hours peace on a Sunday afternoon. That was often the given reason why Sunday schools flourished. It was the only chance parents had to be on their own. We don't have the example of church-going parents. We don't have the example. The depth of ignorance about the Church of England is fascinating. We have a sort of helpline for people with certain distress or whatever. Ring the Church of England because they don't know where else to go. We try to refer them to their local church, and they say, "Am I allowed to go in?"
Yeah,
Now this is
through
centuries has been public space. The parish church is public space. People now think it's a private club.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not allowed in, or you wouldn't want people like me. So we've got a lot of ignorance to overcome. And I think we have actually watched how people come to these existential questions later and later in life. Yeah. But they've tended to come up with one set of answers that were pre-programmed in their youth. If you haven't done that, then they're up for grabs for anything, really.
Yes. Do you think
not least, of course, the plethora of invented religions, which are often hugely manipulative and coercive.
Do you also think that hesitation, perhaps, to enter a Church of England church is I don't know, maybe grounded in maybe history, maybe of sort of, I mean, one example of this was that I was brought up a Catholic, and since doing my ancestry and family history, I've had to go to Church of England churches, actually go inside them. And my grandfather had never been in an Anglican church before because he was Roman Catholic, and they just didn't. They just.
Well, at least he'd been in a church.
Well, yeah,
and so it wasn't that alien. This was just going to. It was like going to the opposition ground.
Yes,
and sitting at the wrong end, didn't it?
Yeah, and it was sort of a scandal for him, to enter a Church of England church. Goodness, you would.
Well, it sounds like you're leaving, you're betraying your own class and your own community. But it's the ones who've never been into a church before, ever, and have no idea what it's for. It's not architecture they're familiar with. It's not, it's not a smell they're familiar with.
Yes.
There's everything that feels alien about it.
Yes.
And the historic point that the parish churches of the Church of England, we don't have a defined membership. We're there for anyone who wants to use us.
Yes. Yes.
And so it has always been. Just to tell you a silly story, you may remember the Occupy movement and the camp they set up at St. Paul's Cathedral.
Yes.
And I was asked to be their link person to the Church of England because none of the bishops wanted to be photographed with them. And I went there in civvies. And we had a really fascinating conversation. We started looking at how Occupy's concerns about financial morality, as much as anything else, could be shared across the communities of Britain, not just in the city. And they were saying, how would we mobilize local community meetings?
Yes.
Where would we do it? And I said, well, every community has a parish church, and the nave of the parish church, not the chancel, which is the holy bit, but the nave where the people sit, has always been conceived of as public space for the community.
Yeah.
And someone wrote up the notes of the meeting who was not a member of the church and said, we are having conversations about the naves of the Church of England, spelt with a K. I had to say, the naves of the Church of England are a very different group of people.
Yes.
But, again, it was a new idea to them. And the concept of the nave was new as well. But that is, we were there for everybody. Catholics, like your ancestors, would have opted out of that because they didn't think we were the real thing. Other people would have opted out because it's their own faith. Others would have opted out because they just didn't believe a word of it. Yeah. But it was there for them if they wanted. We have a legal obligation, for instance, to marry any heterosexual couple who comes to our door.
Right.
We can't at this stage marry same-sex couples for complex legal reasons. That may come. But it's a legal obligation. If you fulfill the residence qualifications of living in the parish, we don't turn you away. We can't. We don't ask we don't ask you to recite the creed and prove you believe anything. It's our service to the people of the community, and that dates back, to post-Reformation, first Queen Elizabeth trying to get us out of the bloodshed of religious warfare. Yes. And where the Church of England and the Anglican Church settled was on being a church defined by geography. Yes. We're the Church of England. We're not defined by doctrine. We're not defined by our leader. We're the Church of England. We don't extend north of Hadrian's Wall or west of Offa's Dyke. And we're based on the parish system. Wherever you are, you live in a parish. That means there is a church that is yours, if you want to use it. There is a priest who is there for you if you want to use them. And it's every community of the country. And the idea was that if you have loyalty to your neighbours, you probably stop burning them because they believe the wrong thing.
Yes. Yeah. It's really interesting how sort of that generational difference, I suppose. Naturally, I would go into a Catholic church because that's what I've been brought up as, but I wouldn't sort of run away from a Anglican church either if I was in trouble.
Some of them you'd find were even more Catholic than the Catholics. Others you'd find unrecognisable. We've always been a deep, ever since the Reformation, or since the first Elizabeth, we have been a slightly unstable, sometimes very unstable coalition of warring doctrines, warring beliefs, people who were convinced they were right and everyone else was wrong. And we've managed to hold them together in the Church of England because of our commitment to geography and place.
Yes. And also, just one of my last questions, because I don't want to keep you too long. I know you're a busy person. Just on that point, actually. So, taking that into consideration, then, where is the discourse at the moment regarding Christian unity? Sort of, I know it's maybe a big topic, but
it's a huge topic.
Maybe just is there anywhere closer to? I don't know, just some...
Well, we're certainly closer to understanding and toleration than we were when we were killing each other.
Yes.
But remember, that was also, if you're looking at the Reformation, it's also caught up with the rise of the nation state,
yes,
which must have been a tremendous threat to many people. The idea that nations had the autonomy to go it alone on anything, including religion. It was to do with who actually set the rules. Was it set at national level, or was the nation part of something bigger called the global church, the Holy Catholic Church?
Yeah.
So where did authority lie? And when authority was in conflict, which one won?
Yes.
And that, of course, was in a question revisited during the English Civil War.
Yeah.
The relative role of the king and parliament as democracy began to assert itself. And Charles II had to come up with a whole new set of laws about toleration. They weren't tolerant by our standards, but they were a lot more tolerant than what went before. Yeah. So we've had to go from grudging acceptance that we share an island with people who believe different things to what we now have, which is a global ecumenical movement, essentially a 20th century phenomenon. Which some would argue, I'm not sure of the facts myself, but some would argue comes out of a perception of weakness, that you need each other, you need allies. It also comes out of the theological conviction that disunity is a scandal.
Yes, yeah.
But we've had to take an awfully long time to understand that unity didn't mean uniformity.
Yeah.
And you have to decide what of your faith is absolutely fundamental, first order question, which you can't compromise on, and what is a matter on which Christians may legitimately differ.
Yes.
And that's a source of endless discussion. We have, I've recently appointed a new ecumenical officer for the Church of England. We're caught up in decades-long international dialogues with different branches of the Christian Church. We have an agreement with the German Lutheran Church called the Meissen Agreement, it starts with what we have in common. Then it becomes a process about discovering what else we have in common, and a process for discerning what we can do together and what we can't do together. So it's an agreement that a German Lutheran priest can come to England and, under certain circumstances, with some limitations, act as a Church of England priest, and vice versa.
Yes.
We have the same with the Nordic churches, called the Porvoo Agreement. We don't have anything comparable with the Catholic Church, but we do have, again, decades of formal conversations which are gradually establishing where the common ground is, and where the areas for cooperation are. So in my work on public affairs, I work very closely with the English and Welsh Catholic colleagues. The great thing about working with our Catholic colleagues is that, like the Anglican Church, which is we are the Church of England, but we're also a global communion. The Catholic Church thinks globally, not just locally. And you've got this fascinating tension between cultures around the world interpreting Catholicism or Anglicanism in ways that are culturally quite specific, and how far do they translate? So we have the dialogue with Catholics is fascinating because it has that global element that says English culture isn't the only thing we're interested in. So that we have, for instance, when the conflict in Ukraine began, we had to get very quickly into the internal disputes and divisions within the Orthodox Church, which broke from the Western Church in, was it 1070? So well over 1,000 years ago, there was this great East-West schism between Rome and Constantinople. And the Eastern Church is as diverse as the Western Church in its way. So it sounds just like, the Monty Python Life of Brian thing, where you have the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea. You have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Now, one of the interesting things in terms of difference is that some trends in Christianity have been that whenever you disagree, you break away and form a new church.
Yes.
I think you've got two conflicting trends in the history of Christianity. One is towards greater unity,
Yes,
and the other is the tendency, if you disagree with someone on something, doesn't even quite minor things, you break away and form a new church. Now, again, I've only been told this; I don't know it for a fact. One of my Scottish friends said that in Stornoway, with a population of about 8,000, you can go to 13 different Presbyterian churches.
Yeah, I heard that. Yes.
I know there are a lot. I don't know if it's 13, but there are a lot.
Yeah,
because historically, you disagree, you split. Because it's about purity.
Yes.
We must keep the congregation pure. No one must think anything that's dangerous. We're facing this, in the Church of England's discussions on human sexuality, whether we should, accept same-sex marriages and so on. There are some who are saying, you make any move on this and we're off. And we'll fight you through the courts for our legal assets. They're going to make a big fight of it. There are others, of course, who just say, if you don't do this, we're not even going to join. So the question is, are you losing more from schism, or are you losing more from just not coming through the door? So really, it can't answer that question. So you've got two trends. You've got the trend towards fragmentation, which I think is an essentially Protestant phenomenon. Once you start defining yourself as more pure than the Church of Rome, then purity becomes really important. And of course, there must be limits to toleration. You can't just say anything goes if you have a fundamental faith. But the other end of the spectrum is God is a hell of a lot bigger than we are. And the kind of fundamental human principle that when you are most certain you're right, you're most certain to be wrong. And so you leave that room for mystery, for doubt, for if we don't want to go to heaven and discover, to go back to the salvation image and discover that all the other people we hated are there, and and we're being let in on sufferance, to use a kind of cliche. So there's this other big movement, the ecumenical movement, which, as I say, is essentially 20th century. I think it came largely out of first the American Civil War, then the First World War, when the prospect of human beings mass murder, mass killing of each other for ideological difference became a reality in a way it hadn't been. I mean, the civil wars, both the English Civil War and the American Civil War, killed a far higher proportion of the population than any other wars. Huge proportion of the population die in civil wars. The First World War was carnage. And people, first of all, said, how does this fit with a God of love? But they also said, if the ideologies that divide people to the point where they can kill each other on this scale can't be tamed, then we've got to ask, in what way has the Christian faith been complicit with that kind of human division that drives people to say, I am so sure I'm right that you must die because you're a threat? And so the ecumenical movement evolved, 20th century movement essentially on rapprochement, really, rather than not unity as uniformity, but rapprochement. What we can do together, we will do together. And you'll find at local level, local churches come together to do all kinds of things. But they don't in the end merge, because each one is emphasizing something that needs emphasizing. And in a way, they're kind of correctives against getting all your eggs in one basket.
Does it sort of fundamentally need to come down to sort of values, I suppose? Just as you were saying about the issue of sexuality earlier on, and maybe the possibility of people leaving. Does it matter if they've left, if it's, as long as the sort of the changes made are in alignment with I don't know, what is true or what is right?
Well, that's the question. What is true?
What do we value more? Getting something right and sort of putting the right faith and message across, or that we have the most kind of followers?
Well, you're right. You're absolutely right. And
I'm not sort of.
It's a genuine dilemma, because to be so pure that you are dead within a generation because nobody can cope with your level of purity is a bit, first of all, it's not very authentic to the New Testament message. But equally, to just do what everyone else does and not to stand out for something distinctive, so long as it's authentic. Just being distinctive doesn't matter at all. Anyone can be distinctive.
Yeah.
It's being authentic. Yeah. And that's the big argument within Christianity. What is it to be authentically Christian in a rapidly changing world and in a world where cultures are drifting apart? See, the question on sexuality is really interesting for us because of our global nature. Yeah. The Anglican Church globally. If the electorate on the question is the Church of England, I would have no doubt we'd be doing same-sex marriages tomorrow. Some people would leave as a result, but there'd be a big majority for it. If the electorate is the global Anglican Communion, there is no way we would touch it with a barge pole, because the great majority of Anglican Christians are in Africa, in places like that, where the culture is very much against same-sex relationships. And the Archbishop of Canterbury can tell you the story of going to a church in Africa where there was a lot, I think Nigeria, I'm not sure, where there was a great deal of conflict with the local Muslim community, where dozens of Christians had been murdered because the Anglican Church, these are Anglican Christians, the Anglican Church in America had appointed a gay bishop, and the Muslim community said Anglican Christians are homosexualists, you're perverts, and he stood by a mass grave of people who had been murdered for being Anglican because of a change that had happened in American culture. Yeah. So you can see how volatile this can be. It's not that, but somehow through that, we've got to find out what is authentically true.
Yes.
And I mean, I'm sure you know enough about ethics generally to know that I teach ethics, as I may have said to you, to PhD students studying artificial intelligence. Yes. And one of the first things I say to them is, you're on an interdisciplinary program. Ethics is a discipline like the others. And just like the other disciplines you study, it's conflicted, it's contested. How do you come to an ethical conclusion is not a tick box exercise. It's about what sort of ethics are you interested in? Yeah. It's about how do ethicists disagree, not just how they agree. So finding authentic theological positions is always going to be tricky. The Bible is not a Ford Fiesta handbook. Not that that's a particularly good guide to changing a light bulb. It's very difficult to write a handbook of any kind that people can actually use. But it's not that. It's a series of stories, and we work out our ethic from narrative, not from propositional logic.
Yes. Yes.
So, but you can also dig back not only into the Christian tradition, but the way the Christian tradition and the classical tradition of Aristotle merged really in the Middle Ages with people like Aquinas, where the philosophical insights from Aristotelian philosophy and ethics were Christianized or became in a dialogue with the Christian faith to give us our very, I think, authentic focus on the nature of the community.
Yes.
Now that's at various levels, communities within communities always. But first, what is the authentic pattern of the Christian community? Yes. How should you live to be a good Christian? But that's a subset of how should you live to be a good human being.
Yes, certainly. Yes. Yeah, and also, as well, I suppose it relates back to those questions we were earlier about sort of salvation, meaning, all these other sort of fundamental topics, doesn't it? It all interconnects.
Yeah. I think the key question is, how do you learn to do the best you can and to seek the good in this life? How do you come to, and for this purpose, the old trope of appearing at the pearly gates after your death, I know it's tosh in terms of the imagery, but it suffices as a narrative. How do you deal with the fact you come up there and find you were wrong?
Yes. Yeah. It's
that wonderful phrase of Oliver Cromwell's when he addressed the General Synod of the Church of Scotland and said, "I beseech you in the bowels of Christ to consider you may be wrong."
Yes. Yeah. It is fascinating, isn't it? Really. I think also what you were saying about these sort of that fragmentation is something very interesting, because I actually experienced that myself, because my grandparents they were Catholics, but they were traditionalist Catholics. So when the Second Vatican Council took place, they sort of opposed that, and they opposed changing from Latin to English, and they actually had Latin masses in their home, and they got told off by the bishop, they got told off by the Pope, and that learning about that since they passed away has really changed my sort of relations with the Catholic Church, I feel, and with some of the priests that I knew growing up, really.
That's a fascinating parable, that. It's the conflict, isn't it, between your duty and your identity as a member of a community.
Yes.
And without a community, you have very little identity.
Yes.
And the concept of conscience.
Yes. Yes. And also, I think something that really, well, basically they were shunned. They were shunned, and in a public forum as well.
They defended against the congregation, against the community.
Yes. And
but you see, if you step out in that brave way, and it is brave, even if you're wrong, on the grounds of my conscience says.
Yes.
You have to take into account the fact your conscience may be misleading you. What is your check and balance on what you think is conscience, which might be vanity, it might be that you're misled, it might be stupidity, it might be all kinds of things. And that's why, the Protestant appeal to conscience, the myth, it isn't entirely historic, but the myth of Luther, as the lone voice of conscience against the Catholic hegemony. Yes. It isn't quite like that, but it's sort of. It's not simply that conscience is something that each individual kind of has of their nature. Conscience is formed. Conscience, just like community belonging, is formed from upbringing, the people you're amongst, the people you aspire to be like.
Yes.
Conscience isn't just a kind of deracinated logic. And so, in the end, it's Alistair McIntyre's question about ethics, that the proper question is not what should I do, it's which community do I want to be part of?
Yes.
Or am I part of?
Yes.
Because that's what forms conscience.
And of course, any church, any community is constantly evolving, isn't it? Of course, if these are the questions of today that need to be answered, and there needs to be some direction from the church, then maybe that, if people can't accept that, maybe that's the evolution of the church, and that's the direction it's choosing.
Well, that's right. And whenever the church of it, sorry, there's a slight time lag, and I missed you.
If you can't be part of that new evolution, of that next step, then maybe that's where your relationship with that church ended, or that membership ends.
It might well be
later, or you might change your mind later, or you've got to have that conviction, and the church has to lead with that conviction. Do you not think?
Yes, and that's where it's always. You see, in the old phrase, churches and religious groups think in centuries, not sound bites.
Yes.
And that's why we're having a lot of trouble at the moment on exactly the question of same-sex marriage, with people in Parliament saying, if you don't get in line with what Parliament passed only a few years ago, don't expect any support, don't expect any, role. Really, it's change with threats is what we're getting. Now, bear in mind that Parliament changed. How long ago was Section 28 prohibiting the promotion of gay relationships under Thatcher? 1980s?
Yeah.
20-something years, less than 30 years later, the position of Parliament is completely the opposite.
Yes.
Now, Parliament has done that journey in 30 years. Why should a church which aims to discern the mind of God, why should it change at that pace?
Yeah.
Now, change when it comes always happens quickly, but the process leading up to change, if you're trying to be authentic to something, because politics now is only in the broadest sense authentic to any creed or ideology. I mean, look at how Liz Truss was a parody of Margaret Thatcher. There was nothing authentic about that. It was simply a parody. if you're trying to be authentic, it takes a long time. We've invested hundreds of thousands of pounds in several years of carefully processed conversations around the sexuality issue. Yeah. Whether they lead to consensus for or against change, I've no idea. There will always be some who won't accept the outcome. But because we believe in moving together. Yes. The principle of walking together with those you disagree with, and trying to thrash out your disagreement peaceably. Yes. Not by saying we take a different path, not by saying I'll do you in, not by saying I've got 51% of the vote, so you bloody well shut up. Yeah. And you can understand the anxiety of those who feel that the church is moving too fast to accommodate culture, because our culture is, by any standards, pretty wobbly. Yes. Yeah. There's a lot in our culture that you could not easily make compatible with a Christian faith. What if, for instance, look, we all look in horror at what's going on in America. Yeah. Now, what if you had a kind of neo-totalitarian mindset in government where facts had no traction, where all that mattered was tribal loyalty, where you were actually under threat of attack if you disagreed with that loyalty? Yes. Where would the church want to find itself? Yes. On precedent, we would be on the side of democracy, but there's actually very little about democracy in the New Testament. We would be vulnerable if, behind Trump, you had people like Steve Bannon who talked explicitly about a great Catholic revival, Catholic totalitarianism on the Franco model, but updated for the 21st century. Now, the Catholic Church, I'll go as far as to say this is potentially libelous, but it has to watch its back against totalitarianism, because the idea of a pope and a curia and a global theology of obedience could easily be captured by secular totalitarianisms. The Church of England has to watch out for the weaknesses of democracy, because, as I said, we are an unstable coalition of people who disagree about most things. And all it takes is someone to win a vote and then kick the other side out. If you're not careful, we have all sorts of checks and balances to keep our three warring tribes in play, but it doesn't stop the potential for the weakness of democracy, which is the tyranny of the majority over the minority. So our different churches have to look out for their weaknesses in parallel to the weaknesses of political ideologies.
Yes, yeah. As well, with the Anglican Church, specifically the Church of England, obviously the secular laws in the United Kingdom now obviously are different to, correct me if I'm wrong, to the Church of England sort of stances on things like sexuality at this moment. So there is an issue there of the country dividing from the church in a sense, whereas for hundreds of years it's been sort of that united.
Absolutely.
So obviously you wouldn't want that kind of fragmentation to get worse. That there needs to be some kind of separation at some point of and will it have to be the church has to concede to the country? Is that what it's going to happen?
Well, I don't think the church will ever concede, to use a word like that. The church is put on its mettle by the society around us to look again at our theology. Yes. If we were to conclude that our theology only points to one conclusion and could not, in our view, accommodate another, we'd have to go with that position, however unpopular. Yes. But the question of human sexuality doesn't resolve itself that easily. The conservative view in the church has pinned its arguments entirely to the idea that the Old and New Testaments are unanimous in condemning homosexuality. They base that on a very small number of texts, most of which are highly ambiguous. So, each side in this argument wheels out scholars, apparently, to prove their point. For every scholar, you have to look, what academic culture are they coming out of? If they're coming out of a liberal European tradition, they're likely to say one thing, even though they're theologians. If they're coming out of a conservative American university, you can be sure they'll say the opposite. So even the academy can't get us out of this.
Yeah.
We've tried the sciences, the natural sciences. The natural sciences are full of fascinating research about human sexuality, but nothing that tells you about right and wrong.
No.
There's a lot of interesting evidence there, but you've got to do your ethics yourself. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, and if you want to boil that argument down, it's to do with absolute loyalty to a particular reading of the Holy Scriptures.
Yes.
This is the only reading, and unless you abide by that, you are a heretic. That's on the one conservative side. But the challenge to that is, are you absolutely sure that's what Scripture says? What you say is the plain meaning of the text has gone through translations, it's gone through interpretation, you are interpreting. There's the other side will say, actually, don't look at individual texts, look at the nature of the story. Look at the story of Jesus. And the story of Jesus is someone who turned to social outcasts and said, look, this is a better example of what God's like than you are.
Yes.
But he didn't, as far as we know, turn to someone of a different sexuality. He turned to a woman caught in adultery. Yeah. In his response was, the one of you without sin cast the first stone. But he didn't say, carry on having affairs. No. He said, stop it.
Yes. Yeah.
You know? So that's not an example. So there are weaknesses on both sides of the argument. None of them is a knockdown argument that, although both sides think their argument dismisses all others, it doesn't. And so, as I said, a very lengthy inquiry into the natural sciences didn't give us a get-out-of-jail-free card. Yeah. And we have to do the heavy lifting.
Isn't it also true that, with politics, politicians can establish legislations, but so easily those legislations can be revoked. And politics is far more fickle than the church can be. If the church makes this position and this stance and it's going in that direction, it has to stick with that. It can't say we believe in this one day and then next.
No, absolutely. Well, that's the point. I mean, our job, our job is to discern the mind of God in order to serve the people.
Yes,
it's not to discern the mind of God just to be clever or to have secret knowledge. It's to serve the human race.
Yeah.
So it's not just I'm right, whatever the consequences.
Yeah.
On the other hand, politics is a very different game, and I was watching very closely as the whole Brexit thing, the Red Wall thing emerged as what you might see as a kind of grassroots revolt against metropolitan liberalism in all the parties. And there's been a lot of anxiety about the racist undercurrents within that movement, which, if you live in one of the left behind communities in the north, it's not kind of naked racism so much as a resentment of the unknown that from a position of deep disadvantage. But I don't think the political parties have quite, although some bits of the right wing of the Tory party have got this, that liberation for people of unexpected sexuality, the whole trans issue and so on, are things that cause huge anxiety in other parts of the country. There may be a metropolitan consensus that, gay pride is a good thing, that it's total equality, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't even translate into the rest of the country, let alone the rest of the world. And so one of the trickiest things in this is the not even slight, but quite overt hinge of colonialism in Western liberalism. Western liberalism's great at condemning empire. What it's not so good at is it's examining its own view that as liberals, we're naturally, of course, on a trajectory of upwards and better all the time. So liberals must be in the vanguard and everyone else is a sluggard or even wicked for not keeping up with us. The colonial implications of that are huge, neo-colonial. We can condemn the British Empire till it comes blue in the face and practice colonialism continuously in terms of ideology. Yeah. And I think it doesn't mean I think that African anti-gay campaigners are right. I think they're wrong. Yeah. But I have to come up with arguments that are not about I'm right because I'm a Western liberal.
Yes.
And you're a primitive African, really. Yeah, it doesn't work. That won't wash.
No.
Can't do that. So some years ago, I rehearsed a similar argument to a journalist who was talking to me about this, and he just said, "Aha, I knew we'd get to colonial guilt sooner or later." But it's more than that. None of us start with a clean slate in terms of global inheritance. We've all, this takes us right back, and probably a good point to finish on in a few minutes, takes us back to salvation. I don't want to be, we may think we've escaped from the sins of our grandfathers. You may feel that your grandfather's apostasy in clinging to a pre-Vatican II Catholicism doesn't impinge on your morality. But I can tell you, my mother came from a little village in Northamptonshire, and she used to go back out of nostalgia because she'd lived in the suburbs of London for so long. She wanted a bit of the country. But there were still, for many years, people she would avoid. They had never forgiven her for being the only kid in her class who went to grammar school.
Right.
That's village life. That's when community becomes toxic, and you've got to take with you the sins of the fathers. I have somewhere in my makeup the racist assumptions of my ancestors. I try not to, I try to be aware of it, but saying I'm not racist cuts no ice with my UKME colleagues. You don't say I'm not racist; you say I'm working at it. Because I've inherited it. Ditto with a whole load of other stuff. And this is the great liberal heresy of constant onward and upward, that we're the exemplars of humanity perfecting itself. Well, the Christian corrective to that is the notion of original sin. It isn't the same as saying we inherit the sins of our fathers. If that were the case, we'd all be guilty. But we inherit an awful lot. And we apply it, and often don't know what we're doing, what a mess we're making. So, if you look at the conflicts within the church and society at the moment as liberalism versus conservatisms of various sorts, or communitarianisms, it's not all good on one side and bad on the other. There's a great version of communitarianism. I think I said when we've met before, I'm a great fan of the Blue Labour, Red Tory movements, which are about restoring our sense of community. But as in the little story of my mother's experience, communities can be toxic. You do anything differently and you're not one of us. We'll completely write you out of history. And the liberal, idea that we're constantly perfecting ourselves is demonstrably untrue. Which takes us back to where we began. It does, and it shows that we really possibly do need salvation, very much so, and it's still very much at the forefront of just to complete that loop, in a sense, because you brought in the question of unity. You spoke particularly of Christian unity, but of course there's also the parallel stuff we're doing on interfaith dialogue, which is parallel to the conversations with other Christians. And it goes back to, and I say, I wish I could find the source of this idea that each religion is about helping to save you from something. And it may be that we have to examine what it is we actually do want to be saved from, do need to be saved from, and draw on the resources of different religions to get insight into that. There's a very interesting piece written, it must be 30 years ago, by Max Stackhouse, an American theologian, who said the next phase in theology's encounter with society is that we need a theology of the religions, plural. We've looked at our own religion in relation to society through various phases, but now the nature of our global and multicultural context means we need a theology of the coexistence of religions. We need a Christian understanding of why there are other religions and how we live with them, rather than treating them as a sort of strange, weird cultural phenomenon that will eventually just go away. That's so true, and that's a really interesting topic to end this conversation, I think, actually. And I hope we can do this again, Malk. I hope there's more to in due course. I mean, think of a good question. Otherwise, I'll just repeat myself. No, thank you for joining me today. It's been stimulating. Thanks, Brandon, and good luck with all your studies as well. Thank you. Thanks very much, and I'm sure we'll keep in touch. And, you know where I am. And hopefully keep answering these interesting questions. We'll see. As I say, think of a few more and we'll have another conversation. Take good care. Nice to see you. See you later. Bye.